Now, Damaris, can you tell me about your work in the field of gentrification and a little bit about the history of gentrification in Montreal?
Okay, well, I've been interested in gentrification in the since the early '80s, when I was a very young researcher, and I was I was teaching my first courses in urban geography, and I would include gentrification as a topic that would really get the students interested in thinking critically about how inner cities areas could go through such cycles, these cycles of decline and then revitalization, spurred initially by individuals who, for different reasons, wanted to quote unquote come back to the city, and then how eventually that process would get taken over by developers and other individuals interested in making a profit. And I would get the students involved in this, and then when I moved to Montreal, which was in the early 1980s, in the middle of a huge recession, there was nonetheless signs of gentrification happening on a small but noticeable scale. And I started to monitor it, follow it, ride around and take photos of places being in the process of being converted with municipal renovation grants.
Right, because you specialize in the role of local governments in the process of condo development. Here in the city of Montreal, back in the late 60s, early 70s, Mayor Jean Drapeau really tried to make Montreal a modern city, build a lot of high-rises. Now, I know the process of gentrification has been ongoing since then, and you mentioned you came and started viewing that in the 1980s. Now, in 2011, it seems that Mayor Tremblay, the current mayor, who's been mayor for quite a while now, is kind of adopting that philosophy himself.
Yeah, well, my take on it is this: that since the late 1970s, which is the end, quote, the end of the Drapeau period, the city of Montreal has been extremely concerned about its population decline relative to the suburbs. And also, I mentioned to you, I moved to Montreal in the early 80s in the middle of a recession that, basically continued off and on from 1976 until the late 1990s, with just a few little periods of boom in between. And so the city has always been very concerned about its population decline, and this metaphor of Montreal being the hole in the donut of the Montreal metropolitan area. And what can the city do to reverse population decline and ensure that it doesn't lose its middle class? And so that's the broader context in which you have to place the City of Montreal's policy in regards to supporting middle-class housing construction, including the type that we would associate with gentrification. And it started in the early 80s with a program that you might have heard about called Opération 20 000 Logements, that was started under the Drapeau and Yvon Lamar administration, and it was continued and adapted in different forms by subsequent administrations, but in a way that in fact has been remarkably consistent for the past 30 years.
Now, where does Montreal is the second largest city in Canada, and the fact that it is so affordable, right now certain communities are pretty affordable compared to other Canadian cities like Toronto or Vancouver, where rents are very high. Where does Montreal fit in this in this structure?
What has actually happened is that Montreal rental housing has become massively less affordable in the past 10 years. And then there has been research done that relates that the price of rental housing to people's incomes, and the conclusion is that Montreal has become a much less affordable city in terms of its rental housing compared to about 10 years ago. And this development has, I think, probably taken the city and the Montreal metropolitan community by surprise, and it has led to increasing difficulties for lower and modest income people, especially lower and modest income families with children. So yes, it's still cheaper than in other Canadian cities. The gap has narrowed in the past 10 years, but especially when you relate it to incomes, the gap has narrowed a lot. And Montreal has seen an acceleration of price increases in its rental housing stock in the past decade. they've increased faster than in Toronto and Vancouver.
Really? Because Montreal still is known as a city of artists and musicians, because the rents tend to be a little bit cheaper here than, and other American cities obviously are the rents are going up. And Montreal, I mean, with all this condo development, who do they expect to move in if they're losing a lot of people to the South Shore, to the suburbs, like you mentioned?
It's young and educated people from the so-called creative class, which is, a cliche I'm sure you've heard a lot about. Empty nesters, people who want to move back from the suburbs, who want to downsize. And so that's why you have condos that are marketed in different price ranges. They're not all luxury condos. There are some at the lower end of market, but the market has gone up so much that actually even the low end of market is quite expensive now.
Right. Now, going back into the history of Montreal and the citizen opposition towards development, I mean, that was started back in the late 60s when Concordia Estates was trying to, because you mentioned inner city areas, and the Milton Park neighborhood was ground zero to that fight.
That was a neighborhood that was condemned by a City of Montreal planning report in the 1970s, if I remember correctly. And I think it's recounted in the book that they had brought on a consultant from the Ford Foundation who had applied this kind of American lens to Montreal and said, this is a hopelessly declining neighborhood, and the best thing to do is to get rid of all this social pathology by demolishing everything and building 16 high-rise towers. There were, and that was the same type of neighborhood-based social movement that you also saw in Toronto and Vancouver and other cities in the 1960s and 1970s.
Now, the process of gentrification, because you've done so much study in the field, the process of gentrification now, can you get into a little bit of detail of how it takes place and how it affects low-income residents?
Yeah. Ever since I started working on gentrification, I have kind of a particular take on an analysis, and the angle that I've always been interested in is trying to figure out, well, we know that the people involved in gentrification are middle class, that they are higher income than the people who were there before, and that is what generates the whole dynamic of displacement, because one group has higher market pressure than the other, and it also has usually better, more resources to get organized and get what they want in the neighborhood. It isn't necessarily the same as what the existing residents want, and so on and so forth. But what I've always been interested in is, why is it? Well, we have the middle class that's changing and evolving, and why is it that some within the middle class we have some groups that are quite happy to go and live in the suburbs, and others that want to establish themselves in the inner city, where they become identified with gentrification. And my analysis on this has been, coming way back, that it is linked to changes in lifestyles in a broad sense. It's linked to changes in the family. It's linked to the growth in non-traditional households. We have a situation where in North American cities, not as bad in Canada as in the United States, but in North American cities there was this whole period where the suburbs were developed for this very standardized model of the middle class, with the stay-at-home mother and the minivan and 2.4 children and tract housing and the shopping center and so on and so forth. Montreal, there's very little single-family housing in the gentrifying neighborhood, so most of it took place through undivided co-ownership or through duplexes. Whereas in other Canadian cities, there's a lot more single-family housing stock, and so you would have a lot more people who would be buying single-family houses. Though there is some in Montreal, but there's not much relatively, which is why the whole question of condos is so crucial to gentrification in Montreal.
Definitely. Now, you bring up the Plateau, and that's the one area that everyone always mentions. I mean, whether you're in St. Henry or Park X.
It was the first to be massively gentrified. It wasn't the first to be gentrified. In fact, there is one former urban planning student called Isabelle Corral, who was the first person to ever do research on gentrification in Montreal in the early 1980s, and she did a study of Shaughnessy Village, the area near what is now the Canadian Centre for Architecture, which was, those were relatively large grey stone houses, but they were extremely run down. And the people who moved into there were, from the outset, relatively wealthy because they were big houses, and it took a lot of money to bring them back up to shape. So that was your classic dual earner couple that would, dual professionals, where they have a high income when they were able to take on such a big project. And then they formed the Shaughnessy Village Association and so on, and tried to change the image of the area with mixed success. In fact, gentrification doesn't always go on this upward trajectory, and it never stops.
There's actually a condo development going on where the Seville Theatre used to stand.
Yeah, that neighborhood, apart from the few streets, that neighborhood actually never really gentrified. It's always had many, many problems. But Plateau is the one where gentrification started very, very quietly in the early 1970s, but of course took off.
Mm-hmm. It used to be a very working class neighborhood, and now it is.
No, it was never. This is a myth.
Okay.
The Plateau was always really an upper working class, petty bourgeois neighborhood. It was always really, really mixed. If you look at the history of the Plateau, even if you walk around, you can get a sense of it. There were some streets that were built that were very working class, the ones that have no front yards, and there's others that are much more, much larger, much more ornate. It was always really mixed. It wasn't a uniformly working class neighborhood. That's St. Henry and Point.
Right.
In some parts of Hochelaga Maisonneuve.
Because they were very industrialized, in the Southwest because of the canal and a lot of immigrants coming here.
Yeah. But nevertheless, obviously nobody would even dream of investing in the Plateau until that what can I say, cultural investment had already been made by people who were involved in the alternative social movements and so on, and for the St. Louis Island section until the Italians and Portuguese had already started investing. Adam, even in the mid-1980s, I can tell you this, when we first started looking around for a place to buy, we were looking at a place on Clark, and the bank said, yeah, not a good street, we don't know if we'd give you a mortgage on Clark. This is in Myland.
Do you find that developers, when they come in, that they're involving the community, or are they just coming in wanting to develop and not have that interaction with the community?
That's a very interesting question, because I mentioned to you before the City of Montreal's policy for trying to get mixed income developments. When developers want to come in and develop new projects, especially if it involves a change in the zoning regulations, they have to get the neighbourhood on side. So there has to be a consultation process. What is interesting is, the question to ask is who gets involved in the consultation. One thing that gentrifiers classically do is that they create neighbourhood associations in which they give a new name. They give a new name to the area, and they try to get that new name as being accepted.
Right.
Now, in the case of Hochelaga Maisonneuve, it was not the individual purchasers who tried to push for the new name, it was developers, but the city went on board. So, OMA, Hochelaga Maisonneuve has become OMA. And even the arrondissement of Merci Hochelaga Maisonneuve has accepted that, with a little bit of hesitation, but they've accepted that. They decided to take the risk.